Imagine you're lying under a heavy blanket. Nothing dramatic is happening. No music playing in the background, no guided breathing, no attempt to meditate or control your thoughts. Just weight, gentle, steady weight, resting across your body. At first, it feels like nothing more than a physical sensation, like any other contact with the world. But then something begins to shift. Not suddenly, not in a way you can point to, but gradually. Your thoughts slow down. The constant background noise in your mind softens. Your breathing becomes quieter, almost without your permission. And your body, which may have been holding tension you didn't even notice, starts to let go. This is the strange part. Nothing in your external situation has changed. The room is the same. Your problems are still there. Whatever was worrying you a few minutes ago hasn't disappeared. And yet, your internal state is different. It's as if your body has decided, on its own, that things are okay now. Why would something as simple as weight do that? From a purely physical perspective, weight is just force. It's mass pressing down due to gravity. There's no meaning in it, no built-in message that says relax or be calm, and yet your body responds to it as if it carries information. Not just information, but reassurance. If you think about it, this is not how we usually imagine calmness working. We tend to believe that calm comes from understanding, that if we think clearly enough, solve the problem, or convince ourselves that everything is fine, then the feeling of calm will follow. But here, the order is reversed. The body changes first and the mind follows. This suggests something deeper about how your nervous system works. It's not waiting for logical conclusions. It's constantly reading signals. Small, physical signals from the world around you and from within your own body. And based on those signals, it makes a decision. Stay alert or relax. The surprising part is how much influence these simple signals have. A steady, unchanging pressure on your body is interpreted not as a threat, but as a sign of stability. There is no sudden movement, no sharp edge, no unpredictable change, just a constant presence. And in the language of your nervous system, constant often means safe. You can test this in very small ways. Press your hand gently but firmly against your arm and hold it there. At first it feels like contact, but after a few seconds it begins to feel grounding, almost comforting. It's the same physical action, but your perception of it changes over time. The sensation becomes less about detection and more about reassurance. This shift is subtle, but it reveals something important. Your brain is not just asking, what is this? It's also asking, is this changing? Because change is what signals potential danger. Sudden movements, unexpected touches, sharp variations, these are the things that demand attention. But when something remains steady, predictable, and consistent, your system begins to downgrade its importance. And when enough signals are downgraded like this, the entire system starts to quiet down. So what seems like a simple physical experience, a bit of weight on your body, is actually part of a much larger conversation between your body and your brain. A conversation that doesn't use words, logic, or conscious reasoning. It uses patterns, stability, pressure, time. And within minutes, that silent conversation can reshape how you feel. Take your hand and press it gently but firmly against your other arm. Not enough to cause pain, just enough to feel a clear, steady pressure. Hold it there without moving. At first, your brain registers it as a simple event. Contact has been made, nerves fire, signals travel, and your awareness locks onto that point of touch. It feels specific, localized, almost like your brain is saying something is happening here. But if you keep holding that pressure, something interesting begins to happen. The sensation doesn't disappear completely, but it changes character. It becomes less sharp, less urgent. It fades into the background of your awareness, turning from an event into a kind of steady presence. It's no longer asking for your attention in the same way. In fact, it may even begin to feel oddly comforting. This is where things get counterintuitive. The physical stimulus hasn't changed. The same amount of force is being applied in the same place. But your experience of it has shifted. And that shift tells you something important. Your brain is not just detecting signals, it is interpreting them over time. At the beginning, the pressure is new. And anything new has potential significance. Your nervous system treats novelty as something worth checking. It asks, is this a threat? Is this important? So it highlights the sensation, amplifies it, and brings it into your awareness. But as the seconds pass and nothing changes, no increase in force, no sudden movement, no pain, the brain starts updating its prediction. It begins to say, this is stable, this is not escalating, this can be ignored. But it doesn't just ignore it completely. Instead, it reclassifies it. What was once something happening becomes something ongoing. An ongoing, unchanging input has a very different meaning in the language of the nervous system. It suggests a kind of environmental consistency, a lack of surprise. This matters because your brain is constantly trying to minimize uncertainty. It is always comparing what it expects to what it receives. When something matches its expectations, when there is no error, no mismatch, the system settles. But when something is unpredictable, when signals change rapidly or don't align with expectations, the system becomes alert. Steady pressure is almost the perfect signal of predictability. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't surprise you. It becomes, in a sense, invisible through familiarity. And in that invisibility, it communicates something powerful. The environment is stable enough that you don't need to stay on high alert. There's also another layer to this. When you apply pressure to your body, you are creating a boundary, a clear, physical sense of where your body is in space. This is sometimes called grounding, but not in a mystical sense. It's a literal increase in spatial certainty. Your brain receives consistent information about the position and limits of your body, and that reduces ambiguity. Ambiguity is expensive for the brain. It requires constant updating, constant checking, constant readiness. But clear, stable input reduces that burden. It allows the system to conserve energy, to shift resources away from monitoring and toward maintenance. So what begins as a simple act, pressing your hand against your arm, turns into a demonstration of how your nervous system prioritizes information. It shows that calm is not just the absence of stimulation, but the presence of predictable stimulation. Not silence, but consistency. And once you start to see it this way, the idea that weight can calm you down becomes less mysterious. It's not that pressure is doing something magical. It's that it's providing exactly the kind of signal your brain has learned to trust. Something steady, something reliable, something that doesn't demand immediate action. In a world full of sudden changes and unpredictable inputs, that kind of signal is rare. And when your nervous system finds it, even in something as simple as a steady touch, it responds in the only way it knows how. By letting go of unnecessary tension and allowing the system to settle. Most people think of the brain as the center of everything, the place where decisions are made, where thoughts are created, where reality is interpreted. And in a sense that's true, but it misses something deeper about how the system actually works. The brain is not sitting there, passively waiting for information to arrive so it can react. It is constantly active, constantly generating expectations about what should be happening both inside and outside the body. At every moment, your brain is asking silent questions. Where are my limbs? How fast is my heart beating? What should I be feeling on my skin right now? And then it compares those expectations to the signals it actually receives. If everything matches closely enough, there's no need for alarm. The system remains quiet, efficient, almost invisible to your awareness. But when there's a mismatch, when something unexpected happens, that's when your awareness sharpens. Your brain flags the difference and directs attention toward it. This is often described as prediction error. Not an error in the sense of a mistake, but a difference between what was expected and what actually occurred. Now think about what happens when steady weight is applied to your body. At first it might be unexpected. Your brain registers it, updates its model, and begins to incorporate that pressure into its predictions. After a short period of time, that pressure is no longer surprising. It becomes part of the baseline expectation. The brain starts predicting, there will be pressure here, and when that prediction is confirmed, moment after moment, something important happens. The prediction error drops. When prediction error drops, the system becomes more confident, and confidence in this context feels like calm. This is a very different way of thinking about relaxation. It's not about eliminating all input or achieving some perfect state of emptiness. It's about reducing the gap between expectation and reality. The closer those two are, the less work the brain has to do, and the less reason it has to keep you on edge. Steady pressure is particularly effective at doing this because it is simple, continuous, and easy to predict. Unlike sounds that come and go, or visual changes that constantly shift, pressure can remain constant over time. It becomes a reliable signal that the brain can lock onto and incorporate into its model of the present moment. There's also an interesting side effect of this process. As the brain becomes more confident in its predictions, it begins to suppress unnecessary signals. It filters out noise, reduces sensitivity to minor fluctuations, and stabilizes the overall system. This is why, under steady pressure, not only does the specific sensation become less noticeable, but your entire body can begin to feel quieter. In a way, the brain is saying, I understand what's happening now. I don't need to keep checking. And that reduction in checking is crucial. Constant monitoring is energetically expensive. It requires attention, resources, and readiness to act. But when the system determines that the environment is predictable enough, it can afford to scale back that vigilance. This is why a simple, unchanging physical input can have such a wide-ranging effect. It's not just influencing one part of your body. It's influencing how your brain evaluates the entire situation. By providing a stable reference point, it helps the brain build a more confident model of the present. And once that model is stable enough, the system shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Muscles release tension, breathing becomes more regular, and the background sense of alertness fades. All of this happens without conscious effort. You're not telling your brain to relax. You're not reasoning your way into calmness. Instead, you're giving your brain the kind of input it needs to arrive at that state on its own. So, the effect of weight is not just about sensation. It's about prediction. It's about how the brain constructs reality from the signals it receives, and how, when those signals become stable and predictable, the need for constant vigilance begins to disappear. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet room late at night. The lights are off, and your senses are slightly heightened because there's less information coming in. Suddenly, you hear a small, unexpected sound, a faint creak, maybe something shifting in the distance. Instantly, your body reacts. Your heart rate increases just a little, your muscles tighten, your breathing changes without you deciding to change it. Even if the sound turns out to be nothing, your system has already moved into a state of alertness. Now imagine the same situation, but with one difference. You are wrapped in a heavy, evenly distributed weight. Something like a thick blanket pressing gently across your body. The sound still happens. The same unexpected creak breaks the silence, but your reaction is not identical. It might still register, but it doesn't escalate in the same way. The response is softer, less urgent, less convincing. This difference reveals something subtle but important about how your nervous system prioritizes information. It is not simply reacting to events in isolation. It is constantly weighing multiple signals at once and deciding how much importance to give each one. The sound is one signal. The pressure on your body is another, and these signals do not carry equal weight in every situation. When your body is receiving steady, uniform pressure, it is also receiving a continuous message of physical stability. There is no sudden movement, no shifting ground, no indication that your position in space is changing. Your muscles are not preparing for action because nothing suggests that action is needed. This creates a kind of baseline state, a background condition that informs how other signals are interpreted. So when the unexpected sound occurs, your brain does not evaluate it in isolation. It evaluates it within the context of everything else it is sensing. And one of the strongest contextual signals available is the state of your own body. If your body is tense, exposed, and ready to move, the sound is more likely to be interpreted as a potential threat. But if your body is supported, contained, and stable, the same sound may be classified as less important. This is not a conscious decision. You are not thinking through these possibilities step by step. The evaluation happens automatically, through patterns that have been built over time. Your brain is essentially asking, given everything I'm sensing right now, how seriously should I take this new input? And the answer depends heavily on the overall state of the system. There's a kind of internal negotiation happening. One part of your system says, this is new, pay attention. Another part says, everything else is stable. Nothing suggests immediate danger. The final response emerges from the balance between these signals. What makes deep, steady pressure so influential is that it is persistent. It doesn't come and go. It doesn't compete for attention in the same way a sudden sound does. Instead, it forms a constant backdrop against which all other experiences are measured. And because it is consistent, it becomes a reliable reference point. Over time, your brain learns to trust that reference point. It begins to treat the state of your body as a strong indicator of the state of the environment. If the body is calm and supported, the environment is likely safe. If the body is tense and unstable, the environment may require caution. This creates a feedback loop. The more your body remains in a stable, supported state, the more your brain reinforces the idea that things are under control. And the more that idea is reinforced, the less reactive your system becomes to small, ambiguous signals. This doesn't mean that you stop responding to real threats. If something truly significant happens, your system will still activate. But the threshold for activation changes. Minor, uncertain inputs are less likely to trigger a full response when the rest of the system is signaling stability. In this way, weight does not block out the world. It doesn't silence incoming information. Instead, it reshapes the context in which that information is interpreted. It adjusts the balance of signals, giving more influence to those that suggest safety and continuity. And in doing so, it changes how you experience even the same external events. Not by altering the events themselves, but by altering the internal conditions under which they are processed. If you trace this response back far enough, it begins to look less like a modern psychological trick and more like an ancient biological pattern. Long before language, before complex reasoning, before the kind of abstract thinking humans rely on today, survival depended on simple, reliable signals. The body had to make fast decisions based on limited information, and those decisions had to be good enough to keep the organism alive. In that kind of environment, physical contact carried meaning. Being pressed against something stable, like the ground, a surface, or another body, often meant you were not falling, not exposed, not alone. It suggested that your position in the world was secure, at least for that moment. On the other hand, being completely uncontained, unsupported, or isolated could mean vulnerability. It could mean you were out in the open, where threats were harder to detect and harder to avoid. Over time, these associations became embedded in the nervous system, not as conscious beliefs, but as tendencies, biases in how signals are interpreted. So when steady pressure is applied to your body today, your system doesn't analyze it from scratch. It doesn't ask, what does this mean in a modern context? Instead, it draws on patterns that have been shaped over thousands of generations. Pressure becomes a shorthand, a quick way of estimating safety without needing detailed analysis. This helps explain why the response feels so immediate and so automatic. It is not something you have to learn in the moment. It is something your system is already prepared to do. The input arrives, and the interpretation follows almost instantly. There is also something interesting about the difference between active and passive signals. If you actively move your body, running, turning, reaching, your system remains engaged. Movement requires coordination, attention, and readiness. It keeps the system oriented toward action. But when pressure is applied to you without requiring movement, it encourages the opposite state. It suggests that action is not necessary, that the body can remain still. Stillness, in this context, is not just the absence of movement. It is a signal in itself. It indicates that the environment is predictable enough that you do not need to constantly adjust your position. And when the body receives both stillness and pressure together, the message becomes even stronger. Nothing urgent is happening. Another layer to consider is how social this response might be. Humans are not solitary creatures. Much of our nervous system is tuned to the presence or absence of others. Physical contact, being held, touched, or supported by another person, has long been associated with safety, cooperation, and reduced threat. Deep pressure can mimic some aspects of that contact. Not perfectly and not in a social sense, but in a physical one. The body registers the sensation of being held or contained, even if there is no other person involved. And that can be enough to trigger similar calming pathways, but this is where things become less certain. While there is strong evidence that pressure can influence the nervous system, the exact mechanisms are still being explored. It is not entirely clear which receptors are most responsible, how different individuals vary in their responses, or how much of the effect comes from learned associations versus built-in tendencies. There are also differences in how people experience pressure. For some, it is immediately soothing. For others, it can feel restrictive or uncomfortable. This suggests that the system is flexible, shaped by both biology and experience. What feels like safety to one person might feel like constraint to another, depending on how their nervous system has learned to interpret similar signals in the past. So, while the general pattern is clear, steady, predictable pressure tends to reduce arousal. The details are more complex. The nervous system is not following a single rule. It is integrating multiple sources of information, weighing them, and arriving at a conclusion that reflects both current input and past learning. And in that sense, the calming effect of weight is not just a physical phenomenon. It is a window into how deeply your history, your biology, and your present environment are intertwined in shaping something as simple and as profound as the feeling of being at ease. At some point, the question shifts from why does this work to something more fundamental. What does it actually mean for a system to be calm? We often describe calmness in emotional terms, as if it belongs only to the mind. But if you look closely, it is something much more physical, something that can be described without using feelings at all. A calm system is one that is not constantly adjusting. Its signals are not fluctuating wildly. Its internal predictions are being confirmed moment after moment without requiring correction. In other words, calm is not the absence of activity. It is the absence of unnecessary activity. It is a state where the system is no longer searching for errors that need to be fixed. Your body is always active. Your heart is beating, your lungs are moving, your brain is generating patterns of electrical activity. None of that stops when you become calm. What changes is the level of uncertainty within those processes. When uncertainty is high, the system becomes reactive. It checks, rechecks, amplifies signals, and prepares for multiple possibilities. When uncertainty is low, those extra layers of checking begin to fall away. This is where something as simple as weight becomes surprisingly powerful. It reduces uncertainty in a very direct way. It provides a continuous, unchanging signal that your brain can rely on. There is no need to question it, no need to update it, no need to prepare for sudden shifts. It becomes part of the stable background against which everything else is measured. And once that background is stable enough, the entire system reorganizes itself around that stability. The heart no longer needs to stay slightly elevated just in case. The muscles no longer need to maintain low-level tension just in case. Even your thoughts begin to lose their urgency because the system generating them is no longer operating under the assumption that something might be wrong. This leads to an unusual realization. What you experience as a thought or a feeling is not separate from the physical state of your body. It is shaped by it, moment by moment. Change the inputs to the system and the outputs change as well. Not always in a predictable or linear way, but reliably enough to matter. So when a steady weight presses against your body and your mind begins to quiet, it is not that the weight is directly calming your thoughts. It is that the weight is altering the conditions under which those thoughts are produced. It is lowering the overall level of uncertainty, and in doing so, it removes the need for constant internal commentary. There is something slightly unsettling about this, because it challenges the idea that your sense of self is fully self-directed. It suggests that your experience of reality depends heavily on physical signals that you are not consciously controlling. Your sense of safety, your level of tension, even the speed of your thoughts can be influenced by something as simple as pressure on your skin. And this brings us to a deeper perspective. You might think of yourself as an observer of the world, a separate entity that interprets what is happening outside. But in practice, you are part of a continuous loop. The world affects your body affects your brain constructs your experience of the world. And that experience, in turn, influences how you respond to the world again. There is no clear boundary where one ends and the other begins. So when you feel calm under a steady weight, it is not just a trick or a temporary effect. It is a demonstration of how deeply interconnected your experience is with the physical conditions around you. It shows that reality as you perceive it is not fixed or purely mental. It is something that emerges from interaction between pressure and skin, between signal and prediction, between body and environment. And in that sense, calm is not something you create out of nothing. It is something that appears when the system, your entire system, finally has enough consistency to stop questioning what comes next. There is a natural temptation to assume that if something works as reliably as deep pressure often does, then we must already understand it completely. But that assumption doesn't hold up very well under closer inspection. The calming effect of weight is well observed, and in many cases, measurable. Heart rate can decrease, breathing can become more regular, and people often report a clear subjective sense of relief. Yet when you try to trace this effect down to a single clean explanation, the picture becomes less certain. Part of the difficulty comes from the sheer complexity of the nervous system. There isn't just one pathway responsible for how you feel. There are multiple layers interacting at the same time. Sensory receptors in the skin, spinal cord processing, brainstem regulation, higher brain regions involved in interpretation, and learned associations built over a lifetime. When steady pressure is applied, it doesn't activate just one mechanism. It influences many of them at once. For example, certain receptors in the skin respond specifically to slow, sustained pressure. These signals travel along pathways that are different from those used for sharp pain or quick touch. They tend to produce responses that are less about urgency and more about background awareness. But even knowing this doesn't fully explain why the effect can spread beyond the area of contact and influence the entire body. Then there's the role of breathing. When weight is applied across the chest or torso, even lightly, it can subtly change the rhythm of your breath, not in a forced way, but in a way that encourages slower, deeper patterns. And breathing itself is tightly connected to the state of your nervous system. Slower breathing can feed back into the brain and reinforce a calmer state. But again, this is only part of the picture, not the whole explanation. Another piece involves expectation and learning. If you've had past experiences where pressure, like a hug or being wrapped in something warm, was associated with safety, your brain may be more likely to interpret similar sensations as calming in the future. On the other hand, if pressure has been linked to discomfort or restriction, the response could be very different. This means the same physical input can produce different outcomes depending on personal history. What makes this especially challenging to study is that many of these processes happen below the level of conscious awareness. You can't easily observe them directly, and they don't always produce consistent results across different individuals. Two people can experience the same amount of pressure and report very different effects, not because one of them is wrong, but because their systems are interpreting the signal through different internal models. There's also the question of timing. Why does the effect often appear within minutes, rather than instantly or after a long delay? This suggests that the system needs a brief period to update its predictions, to confirm that the pressure is stable and not changing. It's as if the brain is running a quick experiment. Is this going to remain constant, or is it about to shift? Once it determines that the input is reliable, it begins to adjust the overall state of the system, even with all these pieces: sensory receptors, breathing changes, learned associations, predictive processing. We still don't have a single, unified explanation that ties everything together in a precise way. Instead, we have a collection of overlapping ideas, each capturing part of the phenomenon. And that might be the most honest place to stop, at least for now. Not with a final answer, but with a clearer sense of the question. The effect is real. The patterns are observable. But the full mechanism remains partially hidden, distributed across systems that are still not completely understood. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the explanation. It's a reflection of how complex biological systems are. The more closely you look, the more you realize that simple experiences, like feeling calm under a steady weight, are the result of many interacting processes, each contributing in ways that are difficult to separate. So rather than reducing the phenomenon to a single cause, it may be more accurate to see it as an emergent effect, something that arises when multiple conditions align: stable pressure, predictable input, compatible past experiences, and a nervous system ready to interpret all of that as a signal of safety. And in that sense, the mystery is still open, not because we know nothing, but because what we do know points to a system far more intricate than it first appears. If you follow this idea far enough, it begins to challenge something very basic about how you think of yourself. Most people carry an intuitive sense that their thoughts come first, and their physical state follows. You feel anxious because of what you're thinking. You relax because you've convinced yourself that everything is fine. In this view, the mind is in charge and the body responds, but the effect of steady pressure points in the opposite direction. It suggests that what you feel, and even how you think, can be shaped from the outside in. A simple physical input, weight on the skin, can shift your internal state before you've had time to form a single conscious thought about it. The change begins in the body, and the mind adjusts afterward. This doesn't mean your thoughts are irrelevant. It means they are part of a larger system, not the sole driver of it. Your brain is constantly integrating signals from inside your body and from the environment, combining them into a single experience that you interpret as how I feel right now. And those signals often carry more influence than the explanations you create about them. There's a useful way to think about this in terms of layers. At one level, you have conscious awareness, the part of you that can reflect, analyze, and describe what's happening. But beneath that, there are deeper layers that are operating continuously, without needing your attention. These layers regulate your heart rate, your breathing, your muscle tension, and your overall state of readiness. They are fast, automatic, and shaped by patterns you didn't choose. When steady pressure is applied, it interacts primarily with those deeper layers. It doesn't need your permission. It doesn't wait for you to interpret it. It simply enters the system as a signal, and the system responds according to its structure and history. Only after that response has begun do you become aware of it, often as a vague sense that something has shifted. This creates an interesting gap between cause and explanation. You might say, I feel calmer because I decided to relax. But the decision itself may have been influenced by changes already happening in your body. In other words, your explanation can come after the effect, even though it feels like it came before. This is one of the reasons humans struggle to fully understand experiences like this. We are very good at constructing stories that make our actions and feelings seem intentional and controlled. But those stories are often simplified versions of much more complex processes. They capture the outcome, not the underlying mechanism. There is also something deeper here about the relationship between perception and reality. You do not experience the world directly. You experience a version of it that your brain constructs based on incoming signals. And those signals are always incomplete. They are filtered, interpreted, and combined with prior expectations. When pressure is added to your body, it becomes part of that construction. It influences how the brain models the current situation. A stable, predictable input makes the overall model more stable. And when the model is stable, your experience of the world becomes calmer, less fragmented, less urgent. This means that your sense of reality is not fixed. It is constantly being shaped by the signals your body receives. Change those signals, even in small ways, and the entire experience can shift. Not because the external world has changed, but because the internal representation of it has been adjusted. So the calming effect of weight is not just about relaxation. It is a small demonstration of a much larger principle, that your mind is not separate from your body, and your body is not separate from the world. They are part of a continuous loop, each influencing the other in ways that are often invisible to conscious awareness. And once you begin to see that loop more clearly, the boundary between inside and outside starts to feel less solid. What you experience as your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of self, They are not isolated events happening in a vacuum. They are the result of ongoing interactions, shaped by forces as simple and as fundamental as pressure, contact, and the steady pull of gravity acting on your body.